Good morning, I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation magazine and asianaviation.com. Today we're in conversation with Joshua Ng, a director at Alton Aviation here in Singapore. Joshua, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
Alton Aviation, I'm looking at your website. You guys cover basically the whole industry from MROs to OEMs, leasing, financing. And I think you recently helped write a study on the industry now in the age of COVID-19.
Yep.
As everybody knows, the industry is waiting for a new normal to emerge.
Yep.
We'll talk about the travel bubbles and the corridors in a minute, but kind of give us the big picture for global aviation at the moment.
Sure. I think, as a starting point, where we're thinking about COVID-19 is, how it has impacted the way that we think about the economy, as well as how it's impacted the air traffic growth. And so when we look at it, COVID-19 poses a very big challenge for that 50-year thesis where economic growth is very highly correlated with the air traffic growth. We have seen that, over the last 50 years, the entire post-deregulation era, where air traffic growth has generally grown at about 2 times that of the economic growth rate. But then, coming into 2020, we do expect that the economy to grow at maybe, to actually decline at, from about between 4 to 8%. But, air traffic growth is likely to decline by 50 to 60% this year. And so this is a very unprecedented kind of challenge. Where we see ourselves today in terms of the new normal, I think from a pandemic point of view, we are probably behind us. The first wave is probably behind us. That's probably the most severe wave. And we do think that, in the second wave, the third wave, governments become more prepared to respond to the COVID outbreaks. That response will be much stronger. And the impact on the global economy will probably be much more muted. From an economic point of view as well, I think the worst is probably behind us as the government's going to, instituted lockdowns and border restrictions. That is really when, the economy was really at this low point. We do think that governments are trying to restart the economy, whether it's through economic stimulus packages to stimulate the jobs, whether it is to restart investments in the economy. I think those are good signs to indicate that the economy is probably on an upswing. However, when we look at like air traffic growth, I think this is somewhat at a stagnation point. We are not really moving on the upslope yet. And the reason I say that is because, even though we have really overcome that low point in April and in May, right now, with some of the second waves that virus outbreaks in Australia as well as in the US, we have seen demand sort of stagnating where it is because the fear of traveling has just sort of increased over, as there are more cases in those economies. And certainly when we look at the broader aviation picture, we do think that there's still going to be some more pain in this environment. It is probably another 12 to 24 months before we are in the clear. And we do think that, we do think that, airlines will likely will have to see more pain. There will be airlines that might have liquidity issues that will necessitate them to go through the bankruptcy process, and downstream their impacts on the OEMs with lower production rates, the MROs with lower MRO maintenance events happening over the course of the next 24 to maybe 48 months.
Yeah, let me jump in there. We don't want to condense the whole interview into one answer.
All right.
But you touched on a lot of points there, and we'll get to all of those in a minute.
Okay.
As we are sitting here toward the end of July, mid to end July, you mentioned in the report that was published in June that, and you just talked about it, that there will be a recovery, but it depends on several things like public health care, state of the economy, governments coordinating responses. You still see that. I mean, I listen to IATA, I listen to ICAO. They are putting out lots of good information, lots of suggestions on how to reopen air travel. But it seems like they're running into roadblocks with governments who are doing quarantines.
Mhm.
how does the airline industry, how does the aviation industry get around those roadblocks that the governments are putting up?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we realize as we look at the regions, as we look at the countries in those regions, is that the COVID has not really impacted these countries or regions uniformly. Countries within those same regions have differing outcomes, whether it is political factors such as the ability to or willingness to shut down borders early or quickly, whether it is country demographics, for example, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, the population density is a lot higher, as well as individual behaviors, right? I think, for example, in Asia, um, the use of face masks has been pretty prevalent, after the SARS epidemic as well. So I think, in our view, it's probably unlikely to see, a global protocol, but we do see a lot more travel bubbles that will occur on a bilateral basis. Governments have tended to err on the side of conservatism. They're willing to shut down borders to contain a domestic situation. So I think, when we factor in some of those issues, we see some of the preconditions for setting up travel bubbles. Would be including mutual trust and respect for policy mechanisms within the countries to prevent, to detect, to respond to the virus waves. And in terms of implementation, thinking about who can travel, how do you manage the travel to make it safe, make it secure for travelers, as well as thinking about the implementation and perhaps even the wind down procedures. Given that the situation is fairly fluid.
Let's talk
Mhm.
two things really quickly. All the webinars that I've been listening to, everybody
Mhm.
talks about domestic
Mhm.
travel will return
Yep.
first, which is not good news for Singapore or Hong Kong because there is no domestic travel. But then regional, international will come back after that,
Yeah.
and business travel will come first,
Sure.
leisure travel afterward. And then you mentioned travel bubbles, and we've seen where China
Yeah.
and Singapore are talking about setting up a corridor.
Hmm.
Australia, New Zealand have been talking about it.
Hmm.
Can you talk about, number one, do you agree that domestic will come back first in places like China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam,
Hmm.
specifically here in Asia? And then let's talk about the corridors themselves, because there
Hmm.
seem to be a lot of, let's say, between China and Singapore. China just said anybody who arrives is going to have to show a negative COVID-19 test.
Yeah.
There seems to be, even though they open up the corridor, there still seems to be a lot of hurdles that people have to jump
Yeah.
over in order to travel.
Sure. So let me take your first question, and in terms of how we are thinking about travel demand coming back. So certainly, Matt, we think that domestic travel will likely return soon, much sooner than say international travel. And the reason for that is because domestic travel, within the same jurisdiction or within the same country, it's a lot easier and a lot more hassle-free for travelers to go from point A to point B. We do think that international regional travel will likely come back next, and that is really out of some of the out of necessity. I think when we look at, for example, say Singapore, Malaysia, or China and Hong Kong, there is a lot of people who are going to visit friends, to visit family, to visit relatives, or simply to go on vacation. And even then, there's also a very strong link on the economic and the trade front, where goods are being manufactured, assembled, or exported, within those countries, and that necessitates the logistics and the supply chain that goes along behind this. And not only that, right, a lot of these countries will also share somewhat the similar cultural heritages or economic relationships. So we do expect that, international regional travel will probably start resuming once these travel bubbles are in place. I think what we can see, from this perspective is, international regional travel has the ability to add about 1.3 billion more seats to the air travel market. And this is based on 2019 capacity data. To put this into perspective, international regional travel is equivalent to about 44% of domestic seat capacity. It's also about 54% of total international seat capacity. And when you add both domestic as well as international travel together, that's about 80% of all seat capacity. And, that's a very good number to get back to in the next 1 or 2 years because of that, what I just described above, trade as well as cultural linkages. I think moving on to your second point, and how travel bubbles can be implemented today. I think one of the biggest travel bubbles that is in place today, is in the European Union, right? Within the member states, there are the framework allows for travel restrictions to be lifted within member state countries, as well as 13 other countries that have low risk profiles of transmitting, bringing in the virus into the EU. These countries are being reviewed on, I believe it's a bi-weekly basis. And, with more countries controlling the situation better, we do expect more countries to be added into this list. I think from that perspective, a multilateral kind of organization would definitely support, travel bubbles actually getting set up. In addition, like countries in Asia in particular, Singapore, China have their own travel corridor, what they call the Green Lane. I think China and South Korea have also implemented something, and there's many talks within Asia, Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia. Those are some of the corridors that we probably will see happening, in the next, I would say, by the end of the year.
Okay. And also everybody in the industry is talking about it's going to be smaller in the next few years. Capacity is going to be, quote, rationalized. Airlines, OEMs are going to right size their employee numbers, which means they're going to fire people, and they've already started doing that. You touched on this a little bit earlier. Do you see that? I mean, that's already started to happen, right?
Yeah, I think we will have to live with the fact that industry will be smaller over the next 24 to probably 48 months as we learn how to, as we accommodate, right size industry to kind of where demand is at the moment. If you look at some of the statistics, right, we had over 31,000 aircraft in the active fleet at the end of 2019. We are looking at about 15,000 aircraft at the trough, which was in April this year. And right now it's about 20,000 aircraft as we go into the summer peak, the Northern Hemisphere summer peak period. So, we don't see the 2019 high watermark actually coming back until 22 or 2023. So, there's a few years, intervening years where the market will be much smaller than what we expect. And certainly, with that, whether it's airlines, whether it's OEMs, whether it is even the financing community, there might be the need to kind of rationalize and restructure to meet the smaller to ensure that you can cope with this smaller aviation industry.
Everybody's been. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here as well. Everybody's talking about stimulating demand.
Yep.
Cut price tickets, Vietjet, Vietnam Airlines offering really cheap tickets. But what about things like middle seat bands that are going to cut capacity? I mean, an airline can't afford to fly at 60% capacity. It's just on a plane. It's just not profitable. That's below break even. And also, it's not just that, but also passenger confidence. I mean, you can offer all the cheap tickets you want, but if people are afraid to fly, they're not going to fly.
Yeah. Matt, I think that you are absolutely correct. When we look at some of the data that IATA has put out, the break-even load factor for airlines is about 77% in 2019. So when we talk about a middle seat band, that brings load factors down to about 50 or 60%. And clearly, there is no long-term prospect for profitability in the, if airlines have had to operate at 50 to 60% load factors. But I think there is a different perspective that I think airlines and maybe even the aviation industry as a whole has to think about is how to get people back into the air. Psychologically, keeping the middle seat open helps create that kind of barrier between passengers so they don't feel like they will be able to contract the virus from the passenger sitting next to them. And that could be perhaps a near-term play where airlines have to think about how how passengers react and how to overcome some of those psychological fears. One of the consumer surveys that I have recently looked at, and this consumer survey actually asked consumers, what would it take to get them back into the air? And of the top five responses, three of them are related to new normal safety and security procedures. And I'll just read out, some of the three factors. Number one, having best-in-class hygiene. Number two, having fewer crowds. And number five, enforcing social distancing. And so, I think as we look into this new normal, it is not just the airlines who need to educate the passenger. It is every stakeholder within the aviation value chain, from the upstream, OEM manufacturers creating products that will enhance the safety of the aircraft that people are flying in, from the airports, ensuring that especially in crowded environments or to help them minimize some of the contact between people during the airport transit journey, and even on the plane, as people try to social distance and try to reduce the touch points so that the entire process will be sort of hassle-free for passengers. So I think all of us in the industry sort of need to play the effort to help regain the consumer confidence in traveling in this new normal.
I'm curious because obviously I'm American, if you couldn't tell from the accent, but are there parts of the world that you think are better positioned? And you mentioned earlier about in Asia, being comfortable wearing a mask is common throughout Asia. I mean, I've lived in Asia since 1997, full time, and have traveled to Japan, have traveled to China. I lived in Hong Kong. Now I live in Singapore. Nobody has a problem wearing a mask. But then I watch the news, and I see people getting into fights in the U.S. and that they don't want to wear a mask. So the virus sort of hit Asia first. Do you think this region is going to come back sooner, or in terms of aviation?
Yeah. So I think definitely, Matt, Asia Pacific countries, especially like China, like Singapore, like Hong Kong, we got through the pandemic first, and we're probably first out of the pandemic as well. I think coupled with some of the behaviors of the citizens, the resident populations, I think there will be increased proclivity to actually get back into the air sooner than perhaps some of the other regions. I think, given what you mentioned about the North American market, I think, putting aside some of the face mask issues, I think, in the next 6 to 12 months when the vaccine is developed, those places will probably be able to kind of resume travel, whether it's domestically, because as you know, North America has a very big domestic market, whether it's the US, whether it's Canada, and so from that perspective, I do think that at least in those countries, the domestic market will definitely be able to regain a rebound much quicker than say perhaps international travel. And also in Europe as well, given that the EU has put together this reopen EU multilateral framework among member states, that has helped regain the confidence of residents, whether it's within those countries or whether it's from outside of those countries, in determining whether it is safe to travel to particular European countries, and what the kind of testing, the kind of measures are in place upon entry into those countries. And so, I think there is a lot more confidence. I feel quite confident that Europe will also be able to get through this relatively quickly.
We talked about you mentioned this earlier about the health of the airlines and bankruptcies, things like that.
Yeah.
We've already seen Virgin Atlantic go into bankruptcy.
Virgin Australia.
Or Virgin Australia, excuse me. Yeah, thank you. And I think Knox-Scoot is not flying anymore.
Thai Airways
right.
is gone.
Hong Kong's Cathay got a bailout. Singapore Airlines got government support. Let's go ahead and combine the entire industry. Are we going to see more airlines going bankrupt? I think you said earlier that yes, we will. And also, let's talk about MROs and suppliers. Spirit Aerosystems in the U.S., for example,
Sure.
big supplier to Boeing. They've laid off people. They've had to go to their lenders and try to cut deals. How are things going to shake out? Are we going to? Obviously we're going to see some more bankruptcies.
Yeah, I do think, at the airline level, we probably have seen the first wave of bankruptcies, and a lot of them are Latin American carriers. We have Avianca, Aeromexico, as well as LATAM filing for bankruptcy. In Asia, perhaps less so, given that there is a lot more flag carriers and governments that are willing to support aviation in general because it's such a big part of the economy. And there are a few, quite a number of smaller airlines, with less than 10 aircraft that have also filed for bankruptcy or ceased to operate, in this post-COVID era. I do think that there will be some more pain down the line for airlines. I think it really depends on how air traffic demand recovers. And the uncertainty is playing a big part in how airlines are thinking whether they can survive or cannot survive, because in this environment, liquidity is a very big part. Having the cash to ride out the crisis is necessary for survival, especially in the new normal as well. I think on the OEM as well as the aerospace manufacturing side, I think we have seen a much reduced production rate. Only 2 years ago, we were producing about 1,800 aircraft a year. The 6-month tallies for Boeing, 70 aircraft, and for Airbus, 100, slightly under 200 aircraft. So these are really, significantly lower numbers. We do think that the supply chain has to kind of reshape itself because production rates will likely not go up in the near term. And similarly for MROs, maintenance is something that is what I would call somewhat discretionary, because airlines in this environment, airlines would like to defer maintenance and to keep the cash on their balance sheets. We do think that the MROs, MRO demand for 2020 will probably be about 50% less than what it was in 2019. And so there's going to be some pain there in terms of especially the OEMs, because they are also on the manufacturing side, they're on the MRO side. And so with two of their cash streams not doing very well, there might be, some, a need for them to kind of restructure, to downsize, and to reshape themselves for a smaller aviation environment going forward.
Sorry about the phone ringing. I think someone was coming to the front door or something and ringing the intercom. Finally, we try to end these in conversation interviews on a positive note. We know the pandemic is serious. Millions of people have lost their jobs. People have died. Is there a bright spot that you can see anywhere in the industry that people can look forward to? Is there something good that can come out of all this?
Yeah, I think, one of the things, as I think about this, is to look at some of the statistics for the 2019 year, which is the year before the pandemic. So the WTTC put out some statistics on how travel and tourism has contributed to the global economy. That's about, travel and tourism in 2019, $9 trillion of contribution to GDP. That's about 10% of global GDP. 330 million jobs, and under $1 trillion worth of capital investment. So, this industry is sustained and underpinned by our desire to travel, whether it's for work, whether it's for leisure, whether it's to visit friends, to visit families. And, those preconditions still exist today in the post-COVID world. The Zoom meetings, the Skype meetings that, we have are not going to change the face-to-face contact that we as human, which is in our human nature, which we desire. And so as we look into the future, sure, there will be a brief period where aviation will probably have to resize and reshape, but we think that the long-term prospects of us getting out of the crisis and becoming stronger after this is certainly never better, especially going through this unprecedented challenge that we are in right now.
Always good to end on a bright note. Joshua from Alton Aviation, thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you very much, man.